Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Defeat into Victory. Battling Japan in Burma and India, 1942 to 1945, by Field-Marshal Viscount William Slim. Introduction by David W. Hogan Jr. Narrated by Nigel Patterson. Introduction. Today, Field-Marshal Sir William Slim is almost unknown in the United States, and only slightly more renowned in Great Britain. The British general who rebounded from the Burma catastrophe of 1942 to form and lead the multinational army that won overwhelming victory over the Japanese in 1944 and 1945, usually receives a few obscure paragraphs in most World War II histories, and almost no recognition among the Anglo-American public. Among those who study the war in Burma, however, Slim has earned acclaim as one of the great generals of World War II, and his memoir, Defeat into Victory, has gained plaudits as one of the classics of its genre, possibly, as one reviewer put it, the best general's book of World War II. Why has Slim received so little notice? To be sure, Burma's status as a forgotten theatre has been a bit overplayed, given the attention devoted to the region in Allied councils and the American media's fascination with Lieutenant General Joseph W. Vinegar Joe Stilwell and Merrill's Marauders. But much of this attention began to decline after early 1944, as the Allies advanced in Europe and the Pacific, and prospects for an enhanced Chinese contribution to the common effort faded. Also, when Americans have looked at the theatre, they have tended to focus their attention on the campaign in North Burma, where the vast majority of their troops were, and where they were trying to build a new supply route to China, and not on Slim's offensive in Central and South Burma, which they viewed as a drive to regain Britain's Asiatic colonies. Then, too, Slim has often been eclipsed by other more arresting figures. The campaigns and personality of Field-Marshal Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, the British general Americans love to hate, has left almost every other British military figure of World War II in his shadow. With regard to Burma, the colourful Stilwell has similarly dwarfed all other contenders, especially in American accounts. Of British generals in Burma, the eccentric Major General Ord C. Wingate, leader of the Chindit raiders, has been the only individual to receive anywhere near the attention lavished on Stilwell. As of early 1944, about the time the Burma theatre began to recede in the consciousness of the Allied public, Slim's career gave little promise of great success. Born to a lower-middle-class family in Bristol in 1891, he was a school teacher and later a junior clerk in Birmingham before receiving a commission at the start of World War I. He was badly wounded at Gallipoli and again in Mesopotamia, and then was invalided to India. Facing little opportunity in the post-war British Army, he transferred to the Indian Army, where he commanded Gurkha units, saw combat on the northwest frontier, served as a staff officer, and attended and taught at various staff colleges. He displayed a capacity for analysis in these assignments, but gained no special notoriety. At the outbreak of World War II, he was promoted to brigadier and command of the 10th Indian Brigade along the Ethiopia-Sudan border. He badly mishandled the brigade's attack on the Italian fortress at Metemmah, but through good fortune ended up commanding the 10th Indian Division, where he fared better. In March 1942 he arrived in Burma, in time to lead the Burma Corps in its disastrous defeat and debilitating withdrawal to India. By 1943, Slim was associated with a long string of defeats. Perhaps Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill was recalling those events when he remarked in 1944, "I cannot believe that a man with a name like Slim can be much good." Such adversity forged the essential humanity that so many have noted in Slim's memoir. As Duncan Anderson stated, the reader looked in vain for a great captain striding across the stage of history, deploying his divisions in accordance with some brilliantly conceived and implemented master plan. Instead, Slim freely admits his frequent mistakes in the First Burma campaign, his damaging delay in ordering the withdrawal to the Imphal plain, his near-fatal underestimation of the enemy's ability to infiltrate to Kohima, and the success of the Mandalay offensive, in spite of seeing every assumption with which he had started the campaign proved wrong. He repeatedly attributes his successes to others, notably the support of his superiors, the hard work of his staff, and the resourcefulness of my subordinate commanders and the stubborn valour of my troops. He finds numerous opportunities to laugh at himself, from his account of a Gurkha sergeant guffawing over his futile efforts to look brave when caught under enemy fire, to his efforts to cheer his staff after a defeat with the remark, "It might be worse, it might be raining," only to have the skies open 2 hours later. Slim is even willing to concede that, in the grand picture, other theatres might have had greater claims to scarce manpower and resources. The contrasts with Montgomery and General of the Army Douglas MacArthur cannot be more striking. Slim could also admit frequent struggles with self-doubt, as his justifiably famous retrospective on the 1942 defeat shows. The only test of generalship is success, and I had succeeded in nothing I had attempted. The soldier may comfort himself with the thought that, whatever the result, he has done his duty faithfully and steadfastly. But the commander has failed in his duty if he has not won victory, for that is his duty. He has no other comparable to it. He will go over in his mind the events of the campaign. Here, he will think, I went wrong. Here I took counsel of my fears, when I should have been bold. There I should have waited to gather strength, not struck piecemeal. At such a moment I failed to grasp opportunity when it was presented to me. He will remember the soldiers whom he sent into the attack that failed and who did not come back. He will recall the look in the eyes of men who trusted him. I have failed them, he will say to himself, and failed my country. He will see himself for what he is, a defeated general. In a dark hour he will turn in upon himself and question the very foundations of his leadership and his manhood. And then he must stop. For if he is ever to command in battle again, he must shake off these regrets and stamp on them, as they claw at his will and self-confidence. He must beat off these attacks he delivers against himself, and cast out the doubts born of failure, forget them, and remember only the lessons to be learnt from defeat. They are more than from victory. Few memoirs by notable leaders have ever reached such a level of honesty and self-revelation as Slim achieved in this passage. At the same time, one finds none of the self-indulgence or self-pity characteristic of so many reminiscences. Through the self-evaluation, moral courage, and mental discipline shown in this extraordinary section, Slim managed to ward off the demons that beset a defeated general, and prepared himself for the challenges facing his successful return to Burma. Those challenges were real enough. As described by Slim, the 14th Army's area of operations consisted of some of the world's worst country, breeding the world's worst diseases, and having for half the year at least the world's worst climate. The theatre lay at the end of long lines of communication extending halfway around the world from Britain and the United States. That, and strategic priorities, resulted in shortages of nearly every item of supply. Within the theatre, operations were hampered by inadequate railroads, poor roads, and a shortage of rolling stock and motor transport. Slim's army would encounter steep, densely wooded mountain ranges cut by streams, and, crossing their line of advance, the Chindwin and Irrawaddy, two of the world's great river systems. Planners had to take into account the monsoon season, torrential rains that began in May and lasted 2 or 3 months, as well as the problem of disease, including malaria, dysentery, and typhus. Most of the population in Burma was indifferent or hostile to the Allied armies. Finally, the Allies themselves were divided by suspicion and diverging interests. The nationalist Chinese were distrustful of Westerners, and eager to preserve their forces for the post-war showdown with the Communists. The British were concerned about the defence of India and recovery of their colonies from the Japanese, while the Americans were suspicious of British imperial designs and eager to build China into a major factor in the war against Japan. In Defeat into Victory, Slim cites as the foundations of victory building up the theatre's logistical infrastructure and supply reserves, maintaining the Army's health, and rebuilding the Army's morale. None of these would sound especially unusual to the military professional, but in the Burma context they each assumed special importance. With regard to logistics and health, Slim, of course, faced obstacles common to Western armies operating on the Asian mainland in the mechanized age. He was well aware of the importance of administration and logistics to his success, notably in the case of the decisive battle for Imphal, where he could rely on good lines of communication while the Japanese suffered from elongated and exposed lines of supply. His conscientious attention to logistics and health issues paid dividends to the 14th Army throughout the campaign. To meet the logistical challenge, Slim preached frugality and self-reliance, reminding his troops that God helps those who help themselves. His resourceful logisticians improvised material for all-weather road surfaces and assembled a flimsy but effective collection of vessels for reconnaissance and support of river and seacoast operations. Air supply in particular made his operations possible, as the Allies developed a highly efficient system of airdrops, transport and evacuation to maintain the 14th Army in the field. Indeed, so great was the demand for parachutes for airdrops that his supply officers, lacking enough silk, used jute, common in the Bengal region, to manufacture serviceable chutes. In his memoir, Slim acknowledges the crucial role of air transport in his operations, but is also careful to point out air supply's dependence on air supremacy, the key role of the Army as well as the Air Force in arranging deliveries, and air supply's limitations in sustaining an encircled force over long periods of time. In Defeat into Victory, Slim also remarks, "The most important thing about a commander is his effect on morale." Again, this is one of those shibboleths familiar to those steeped in military affairs, but its application is not always so easy. What impresses the reader about Slim is the methodical yet insightful way in which he approaches the subject. He notes the psychological ascendancy that the Japanese held after the 1942 campaign, exacerbated by the hardships of the theatre, the sense of distance from home, and, in the case of Commonwealth troops, the lack of enthusiasm to die for the British Empire. Developing a program aimed at the spiritual, intellectual and material foundations of morale, Slim managed to convince his troops that they were part of a larger team whose mission was to destroy the embodiment of evil, the Japanese army. Through thorough training, tactical adjustments and carefully planned operations, his troops became convinced that they could maneuver in the jungle and defeat the Japanese. Slim's personality was crucial to the rebuilding of morale. He displayed a natural talent as a manager of men, choosing the right people and providing steadfast support while allowing them the leeway to do their jobs. Although the reader cannot get the full sense of his personal impact from the memoir, plenty of accounts exist of Slim's common touch in his frequent personal visits to the troops, the way in which his physical presence and bulldog jaw inspired confidence, and not least, the effect of his ability to speak English, Gurkhali, or whichever other dialect the occasion demanded. Raymond Callaghan describes an astonished British soldier near Metila, who encountered the army commander, virtually unaccompanied, carbine slung on his shoulder, telling him and his companions, without Montgomery's stagecraft or Lieutenant General George S. Patton's histrionics, that the sooner they took Rangoon, the sooner they would be on the big ships home. He quickly won the affection and admiration of his men, who called him Uncle Bill. In his comments about his allies outside his own army, Slim is surprisingly more guarded in his comments on the Americans than on the Chinese, although he praises individuals of all nationalities. While noting the Chinese disregard for time, their bent for theft, and their obsession with face, he effusively extols the courage, endurance, and eye for terrain of the Chinese soldier. In contrast, even though he pays tribute to the American logistical effort in constructing the Lidu Road, he points out that the Americans had available a quantity of machinery that made our mouths water. One senses in his account irritation at the extravagant claims of American ingenuity in the construction of the road, at a time when his own troops were building roads in terrain as difficult with much less equipment. Part of his irritation, too, may be attributed to the American focus on building the road through northern Burma at the expense of support for a southern offensive that in the British view would have opened a really effective link with China. Slim condemns as a distortion the American suspicion that the British hoped to regain their empire with American lives, but he must have recognized how plausible such a suspicion would be to Americans. Notwithstanding his disagreements with Stilwell on many points of strategy, Slim actually appears to like the acerbic American. To be sure, he clearly finds Stilwell to be a bit of a caricature, with his stubbornness, his unnecessary prejudices, and his efforts to maintain for press and public the image of a rugged foot soldier, uninterested in the trappings of command. But Slim was impressed with Stilwell's mental and physical toughness, determination, sincerity, and courage. He evaluates Stilwell as not a great soldier in the highest sense, but he was a real leader in the field. No one else I know could have made his Chinese do what they did. Obviously, Slim was flattered that Stilwell, after making a long and tenacious argument against coming under the British general, who served as Commander-in-Chief of Allied land forces for Southeast Asia, suddenly offered to place himself under Slim, his junior and a mere army commander. Stillwell's action revealed the high regard in which he held Slim as a fighter, a regard he displayed for few other British officers. As early as March 1942, during the disastrous First Burma campaign, Stilwell had written in his diary, "Good old Slim. Maybe he's all right after all." Slim's reaction to Wingate was nowhere near as positive as his reaction to Stilwell. While acknowledging the great moral benefits of the Chindit's first mission and the courage and endurance of the raiders, he denounces the raid as an expensive failure. His regard for Wingate slipped even further during the opening phases of the second Great Chindit raid in March 1944, when Wingate, overwrought by reports of obstacles on one of the three crucial Chindit landing zones, became fearful that his troops would be ambushed and thrust on Slim the responsibility for continuing the operation. Part of Slim's dislike might have come from a discomfort with strongly egotistical missionary personalities like Wingate and MacArthur, both of whom receive little praise in the memoir. Looking back on the Chindit operations, Slim concludes that special forces are wasteful, taking men and resources that would find better service in more orthodox formations. He insists that he was not opposed to Wingate, and indeed agreed with many of the man's ideas, but most of his discussion gives precisely the opposite impression. His animosity towards the Japanese is even more evident. From the time he arrives in Burma, in the best tradition of Sun Tzu, he makes it his business to know his enemy. He praises their fighting qualities and what seems to him to be an almost innate aptitude for night fighting, a skill that comes harder for his white troops from urban backgrounds. But he also finds the Japanese, particularly their leaders, to be predictable and inflexible, at a loss when their initial plans do not work. From a Chinese officer, Slim gains the insight that if one can only hold against the initial Japanese onslaught, waiting until they exhaust their meagre supplies, one can eventually counterattack, a lesson Slim used to good advantage at Imphal. One senses, in his view of the Japanese, not only a personal antipathy, but also a lack of comprehension, arising not just from the atrocities that the enemy perpetrated against his troops, but also their fanatical discipline and seeming penchant for suicide missions. Even when complimenting the Japanese fighting man, Slim views him as essentially subhuman, as in his description of the individual Japanese soldier as the most formidable fighting insect in history. Contrary to MacArthur's wishes, he forces his Japanese counterparts at war's end to give up their swords, thereby driving home the realization of defeat. It took Slim years to receive the recognition he deserved. Even Imphal, though it earned him a knighthood, did not spare him criticism for cautious, unimaginative tactics. In the ensuing drive into Burma during 1944 and 1945, including his brilliant crossing of the Irrawaddy and thrust to Metila, he displayed plenty of imagination, even genius. Still, after Slim returned home following the surrender, he received a lukewarm reception. Montgomery and Field-Marshal Sir Harold Alexander were the heroes of the hour. Even Churchill gave more credit for the Burma victory to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten and Alexander than he did to Slim. In 1947, Slim retired to become Deputy Chairman of British Railways, but he received a measure of recognition when, over the objections of his predecessor Montgomery, he returned to active duty in 1948 as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. 5 years later, he became Governor-General of Australia. While he was serving in that post, in 1956, Castle and Company published his Defeat into Victory. The work became an immediate sensation, selling out the first edition of 20,000 within a few days. Slim became a military hero, and his memoir won applause as the classic account of the Burma campaign. Although Slim has returned to near anonymity among the general public, Defeat into Victory has retained its lustre over the years, as generations of military historians who have read it can attest. It stands as a monument to a great soldier and a better man. Cooper Square Press is to be applauded for making available once more this timeless account, which reminds the reader once more that human beings fight wars, and, moreover, that nice guys can finish first. David W. Hogan, Jr., Washington, D.C., June 1999. Preface. A general who has taken part in a campaign is by no means best fitted to write its history. That, if it is to be complete and unbiased, should be the work of someone less personally involved. Yet such a general might write something of value. He might, as honestly as he could, tell of the problems he faced, why he took the decisions he did, what helped, what hindered, the luck he had, and the mistakes he made. He might, by showing how one man attempted the art of command, be of use to those who later may themselves have to exercise it. He might even give, to those who have not experienced it, some impression of what it feels like to shoulder a commander's responsibilities in war. These things I have tried to do in this book. It is a personal narrative, written from the standpoint of a corps or army commander in the field, whose outlook was often limited by his own surroundings. It is based on a short account I wrote at the time, a skeleton diary, some contemporary papers, and my recollection. For any inaccuracies, and of course for its opinions and judgments, I only am responsible. If in places I have noticed by name individuals, units, and formations, that is usually because I happened to be near them at a particular time, and they caught my eye. I am very conscious that for every one I mention, there were 100 others whose doings were just as worthy of record. Named or unnamed, I shall always be proud to have served with them. Victory in Burma came not from the work of any one man, or even of a few men, but from the sum of many men's efforts. We all, even those among us who may have seemed to fail, did our best. Luckily, that combined best proved good enough. W. J. Slim, Field-Marshal, Canberra, 1st of December, 1955. Book 1. Defeat. Chapter 1. Into Burma. It was good fun commanding a division in the Iraq desert. It is good fun commanding a division anywhere. It is one of the 4 best commands in the service: a platoon, a battalion, a division, and an army. A platoon, because it is your first command, because you are young, and because if you are any good you know the men in it better than their mothers do, and love them as much. A battalion, because it is a unit with a life of its own. Whether it is good or bad depends on you alone. You have at last a real command. A division, because it is the smallest formation that is a complete orchestra of war, and the largest in which every man can know you. An army, because the creation of its spirit and its leadership in battle give you the greatest unity of emotional and intellectual experience that can befall a man. It was especially good to be commanding the 10th Indian Division. We had, as a division, found ourselves. We had scrambled through the skirmishes of the Iraq Rebellion, been blooded, but not too deeply, against the French in Syria, and enjoyed unrestrainedly the opera bouffe of the invasion of Persia. We had bought our beer in Haifa and drunk it on the shores of the Caspian. We could move, we could fight, and we had begun to build up that most valuable of all assets, a tradition of success. We had a good soldierly conceit of ourselves. Now, in March 1942, in spite of dust storms, equipment shortages, obsolete armament, and an overdose of digging strong points, it was stimulating to be at what we all felt was a critical spot, waiting for the threatened German invasion of Turkey. If it came, and the Panzer divisions rumbled over the pearl-tinted horizon, we should be the soft-skinned orange flung in front of the steamroller. But meanwhile it was exhilarating to go bucketing about the desert 100 miles a day, sweeping our field glasses round a great circle of bare sand. The desert suits the British, and so does fighting in it. You can see your man. So when I was called to the telephone at my headquarters in the wrecked flying boat station at Lake Habbaniyah to speak to the army commander in Baghdad, and was told to fly to India within the next 3 days, my heart slumped. "Am I sacked?" I asked. "No, you've got another job." "But I don't want another job. I want to stay with my division." "A good soldier goes where he's sent and does what he's told." And the telephone rang off in my ear. Constant sandstorms held up my departure for a few days and prolonged the unhappiness of saying goodbye, but at last I was chuffing out into Habbaniyah Lake to the flying boat. Through the sand, still blowing and stinging my face, I watched the half-dozen figures of my divisional staff who had come to see me off fade quickly into the haze, and I felt as forlorn as they looked, hunched against the driving sand. The flying boat loomed up, I scrambled on board, bumped my head in the low entrance, as I nearly always do, and heard the crew discussing whether it was too thick to take off. However, the pilot decided it was not, and up we roared. I cheered myself with the thought of the cable I had sent telling my wife to meet me at Delhi, but I was feeling glum enough at leaving my division. We came down next day on the shrinking lake outside Gwalior, and after a tedious train journey I met my wife at Delhi station. Next morning at General Headquarters, India, no one seemed able, or at any rate willing, to tell me what my job was to be. The only thing that was definite was that I was to fly to Burma almost at once with Lieutenant General Morris, the Chief of the General Staff in India, who was visiting the front to get a first-hand view of a not-too-bright situation. Why I should go, in addition, I did not know, but this time I was a good soldier, went where I was sent, did what I was told, and asked no questions. We left early, spent the night in Calcutta, and then flew on to Akyab, a little port on the Arakan coast of Burma. It seemed a very pleasant, peaceful seaside town, much cleaner and better kept than similar places in India, as indeed were all Burmese towns and villages. We sat up late discussing the situation with Air Vice Marshal Stevenson, the air officer commanding in Burma. Rangoon had fallen on the 9th of March, a few days before, and the British force had extricated itself with difficulty, but was now clear and reorganizing. The position, both on the ground and in the air, was an anxious one. In the air we had, in the face of great enemy superiority in numbers, been undoubtedly more successful than we had been on land. The importance of air power in any theatre is obvious, but in Burma it was from the very start a dominating factor. In plans for the defense of Burma made before the Japanese...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?